settle down now. Hello, travelers. This is Professor Black. Welcome to Invokation Akademy's TCG 101 series, where we'll learn various TCG concepts through easy-to-understand 10-minute lessons. Our goal is to turn you from a third-rate duelist with a fourth-rate deck into a genius invocation champion. One of the biggest challenges for a newer player is figuring out how to build a good deck. And all too often when they ask for advice, they'll simply be told to go copy an existing meta list and play that instead. While that's definitely solid advice if your only goal is competitive play and to start winning more, I'm sure many of you will agree it's not really a satisfying answer. A lot of the time, the fun of TCG not only comes from winning, but winning in your way with characters you want to play, not with someone else's deck. But deck building is hard, really hard. And with new cards constantly being added, it only gets harder over time as your options increase. Very often, players will build what they think is a pretty good deck, only have it to match up very poorly against real opponents or even NPCs and not understand why. Unfortunately, because it's so difficult, it's equally difficult to teach. And I'm not even going to attempt to fit some kind of deck building guide into a single lesson. For starters, each archetype value cards very differently, and so in the future, I may try and tackle each one individually for those who really want a deep understanding of how to build a deck. But for today, I'm going to focus on a general overview, giving the 5 most common mistakes I see from beginners posting their deck lists and how to avoid them. So let's go with the thematic mistake number 1. Lots of one-of cards. This is a really easy one to fall for because as a newer player, you kind of feel like you want to have a card in your deck for every situation. So when the moment comes up, you have a chance to draw it. After all, there's no real cost to putting a card in your deck, right? Well, here's the problem. There actually is a hidden cost, which is you're replacing for another potentially more powerful card. You want to make sure that you are drawing your most powerful cards as often as possible, which means you'll usually want 2 of them at all times. I often joke that if you could run a deck with 30 Wovens, you would because it's one of the most powerful cards in the game. But for cards that are more situational, you can often run 1. So here's a few simple questions to figure it out. Ask yourself, do you want to draw this card every game? If yes, then you should probably play 2. Okay, but what about cards that are bad in multiples, for instance, talents? Well, if having round 1 is very important, you should still play 2. Otherwise, you can consider playing 1 and just add more card draw so you see it more frequently. Then for cards that are both situational and pretty bad in multiples that you never want to have 2 in your hand at any one time, cards like I Haven't Lost Yet, you should probably just play 1. But do keep in mind, one-ofs are generally the exception, not the rule. Mistake number 2. Either too little or too much fixing. Either extreme is bad. Decks with too little fixing won't be able to use their skills often enough, leading to the feeling that the game is too reliant on dice RNG. This can then often cause players to overcompensate and add too much fixing, which means that even though their dice rolls now are pretty consistent, their cards just aren't impactful enough and they're going to lose to more streamlined decks. Of course, what the right amount is could be a whole lesson on itself, but as a general guideline, your average deck could probably start with 2 Liben and 2 of another card like Bestus or Favonius Library as your main fixes. If your deck relies on 5 cost skills, then you can consider adding 1 or 2 more and start thinking about Toss-Up or Jade Chamber. And if at that point it still doesn't feel like it's enough, then what you're missing isn't more fixing, but you want to add more ramp or card draw. So start thinking about cards like Paimon, Sumeru City, Strategize, or Sealy. If you haven't already, this is a great time to check out the TCG 101 video on how to beat bad RNG, where I go over some of these concepts in more detail. Mistake number 3, their game plan is too greedy. Okay, for this, let me pitch you a deck. Xingqiu, Toma, Alhaitham. Here's the plan. You want to stack both Xingqiu and Toma's burst, then infuse Alhaitham's attacks, and what you can get is a bloom, then a burn and burgeon on every hit. Doesn't that sound completely broken? And it definitely would be if you had the time to pull it off. But the reality is, most Genius Invocation games only last to about round 3, maybe early round 4, which means in most games, you've only got about 24 dice in total to work with. So let's count that up. Both bursts would already be at 18 dice. We can throw in 3 more for Alhaitham's skill, 2 more for swapping between characters, and let's see, we're already at 23 out of 24 dice before our deck even starts doing damage. On top of that, this whole time your opponent is also playing their deck, executing their own game plan that you need to not lose to. So if your plan simply involves too many pieces, you're not going to have the time to put it together. So how do you avoid this? Well, when building a deck, try to just focus on 2 core characters that pair well together as your primary game plan in rounds 1 and 2, working towards just one of their bursts. duelists. Then make sure your third character is someone that can hold their own and is particularly good in a 1v1 situation. You'll often hear this character referred to as an anchor, as they are the ones most often going to carry you over the finish line. Mistake number 4, too many talents and weapons. Okay, this one isn't really your fault though. Talents look like they should be played all the time, but the reality is most of them aren't very good. Weapons too are pretty enticing, but they're really expensive and not all decks can actually make use of them well. If you're new, I generally recommend you start building decks without weapons and talents to start and instead focus on playing your other cards. Then once you have more experience, you can learn when to break this rule with specific talents or weapons in the right deck. And tying back into mistake number 3 about being too greedy, remember you don't need to gear up all 3 of your characters equally. If you are playing equipment, you're generally focusing on just 1 or 2 characters for those equipment. And last, mistake number 5, changing decks or cards in those decks too frequently. A very common question I see when people ask for deck building advice is to frame it that they want to change their deck to beat this other specific deck that they're really having a problem with. But often, changing up your deck too much to deal with one other specific matchup just means you're going to suffer more losses in your other matchups and you'll end up right back where you started, now losing to decks that you were winning against before. Remember, every deck has built-in weaknesses depending on its archetype, and there's no way you'll cover all the bases. If there was, everyone would be playing that deck. If you haven't yet, I'd recommend checking out the TCG 101 on archetypes, where I kind of go over this rock, paper, scissors relationship that decks tend to have with each other. Also, you tend to find your gameplay improving a lot quicker if you're not constantly switching to different decks. And there we have it. So by now, you're a complete expert in deck building, right? Of course, far from it. Deck building, again, is much harder than actually playing the game. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so common for players to copy other successful decks to play. However, if you can at least just avoid these 5 common pitfalls, you'll already be leagues ahead of anyone else trying to build a deck without this kind of framework. Of course, to really get into deck building, we're gonna need to look at individual archetypes one by one, as each one demands something very different from your deck. But that will have to wait until next time. For now, try to keep these tips in mind the next time you're inspired to build a deck and see if you start winning more. If you want to see these concepts put into practice, make sure to drop by the Duelist Theatre for deck guides and gameplay. If there's anything you'd like to see in an upcoming video, drop a comment and I'll see how I can help. Be sure to enroll in our courses by subscribing so you can be notified when a new lesson is available. Until then, class dismissed!